Stanley Milgram grew up in the shadow of the Holocaust. With his parents having fled Europe and other relatives dying in the camps, the question of human evil was deeply personal. He dedicated his career to understanding why ordinary people participate in atrocities. When the architect of the Holocaust, Adolf Eichmann, went on trial in 1961, the world watched in horror. The public wanted a monster, but the man in the glass booth claimed he was simply an administrator following orders. This raised a terrifying question. Were the perpetrators of atrocities unique psychological aberrations, or could anyone be compelled to do the unthinkable? 3 months into the trial, a 27-year-old assistant professor at Yale University decided to find out. Milgram built an elaborate, punishing psychological simulation designed to test the exact breaking point of the human conscience. Milgram's experiment attempted to prove that the systemic obedience of the Holocaust could be replicated inside a quiet Yale laboratory. The setup was a carefully orchestrated deception. A naive volunteer, the teacher, was seated in front of a massive shock generator. They were ordered by a stern man in a gray lab coat to deliver electric shocks to a learner in the next room every time he answered a memory question incorrectly. The learner was actually an actor, and the shocks were completely fake, but the teacher didn't know that. They watched the machine's dial escalate with every wrong answer, starting at a mild 15 volts, climbing in agonizing increments, to a final set of switches labeled ominously, Danger, XXX. Before the test, psychiatrists predicted only 0.1% of people would pull the final switch. They were incredibly wrong. A staggering 65% of participants obeyed orders and delivered the maximum 450-volt shock to a silent, seemingly unconscious stranger. When the New York Times published the results, it triggered a global sensation. The public latched on to a deeply pessimistic narrative. Strip away the thin veneer of society, and any ordinary neighbor is capable of lethal cruelty if a man in a lab coat tells them to do it. But this leaves us with a difficult tension. Did Stanley Milgram uncover a universal, terrifying reality about human nature? Or did a brilliant young scientist manufacture a theatrical nightmare to answer the trauma of his own past? The famous 65% figure is often where the story stops, but that single baseline test was only the beginning. Milgram actually ran 23 distinct variations of his experiment, changing one element at a time to build a precise psychological map of authority and compliance. This floor plan highlights his core discovery. When the teacher and learner are in separate rooms, obedience remains at its absolute highest. But if the protocol forces the teacher to physically press the man's hand onto a shock plate, compliance plummets to 30%. The data paints a remarkably clear picture. The closer you are to the harm you cause, physically, visually, or emotionally, the harder it is to continue. The further removed, the easier obedience becomes. He concluded that destructive behavior is a product of situational design rather than individual character. The scientific community, however, was immediately torn. In 1964, a psychologist named Diana Baumrind published a severe critique of Milgram's methods, and the celebration of his genius quickly turned into intense condemnation. Baumrind focused directly on the human cost. The men and women who volunteered for the study were pushed to the edge of nervous collapse. They were sweating, trembling, and begging to stop, enduring severe psychological trauma under the illusion that they were actually killing someone. The professional backlash was severe. The American Psychological Association suspended his membership application for a year to investigate him for ethical violations. Later, Harvard University denied him tenure, citing the brutal nature of his experiments as a key reason. In a sharp historical irony, the experiment that flagrantly violated ethical norms is the reason modern researchers have rules. Milgram's willingness to cross the line directly contributed to the strict federal protections that govern human subject research today. For decades, the ethical debate was the main controversy. But in 2013, Australian psychologist Gina Perry dug deep into the Yale archives and found something much worse. Her investigation threatened to invalidate the science itself. Perry discovered glaring inconsistencies between Milgram's published papers and his actual audio recordings. Officially, if a participant refused 4 specific verbal prods, the experiment ended. On tape, however, the experimenter frequently ignored this rule, coercing and badgering participants dozens of times until they finally submitted. Even more troubling was what Milgram left out entirely. He possessed an unpublished analysis showing that a significant number of his subjects suspected the entire setup was a theatrical ruse. They didn't believe the shocks were real. If the people pulling the final switch knew the victim was faking it, the famous 65% compliance rate loses its teeth. It measures awkward politeness instead of murderous obedience. Milgram's defenders push back hard on this. They point to the visceral, agonizing physical distress captured on tape. People who know they are in a safe, fake scenario do not suffer nervous breakdowns and uncontrollable stuttering. The bodily reactions prove the fear was genuine. This leaves us staring down a profound scientific dilemma. If the lab was a torture chamber and the data was shaped to fit the hypothesis, can we actually trust anything Stanley Milgram claimed about the roots of human evil? We can never rerun the original study to check the math. Modern ethical standards, primarily the Belmont Report, strictly forbid it. To verify Milgram's claims, contemporary scientists rely on modified, partial replications that protect the participants. Researchers like Jerry Berger in 2009 and a team in Poland in 2017 designed clever workarounds. They stopped the trials at lower maximum voltages and instituted immediate psychological safeguards, allowing them to test the exact same pressure cooker of authority without the lasting trauma. This bar chart compares the original data against modern results. It shows Milgram's 1961 baseline of 65% next to Berger's 70% and Dolinsky's 90%. Despite 50 years of cultural evolution, modern obedience rates remain remarkably consistent with Milgram's original findings. With the core theory validated, we must look past the laboratory. The rules of situational obedience map directly onto the architecture of systemic historical atrocities. The men tried at Nuremberg weren't acting in a vacuum. They were operating within a massive bureaucratic machine specifically designed to distance them from the harm they were causing. We see the exact same mechanisms at work in modern institutions. When authority is unquestioned, the victim is dehumanized, and the chain of command diffuses personal responsibility, ordinary people commit terrible abuses. Stanley Milgram was a flawed messenger who crossed ethical lines and curated his data. Yet his ultimate warning remains. He demonstrated that ordinary citizens, when placed inside a structure of destructive authority, become the agents of atrocity. Recognizing that architecture is our primary defense,